Hello everyone. In our previous video, I talked about adding infrastructure as code to my Cloud Resume challenge. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Let me show you what I've got. So this is how I use Terraform on my Cloud Resume challenge front end. I decided to split up into two parts in order to have a video sooner rather than later. And today we'll be revisiting the challenge homepage, looking at the resources that I need to convert into Terraform code, actually hitting apply. And while it's applying the code, I will show you how the Azure resources map over into Terraform. And then when it's all done, we'll check out the Terraform deployed resources. And finally, we'll talk about the obstacles encountered and options for extending the project. Let's go to talk about the Cloud Resume challenge itself. There's a quick intro here. I chose to do the Azure one to back up my certifications. And it's just 16 different steps to give you hands-on experience. And then today we'll be talking specifically about steps 2 to 7, which represent the front end, which is the resume itself. And if you would like to find out more about this, the link is up here. And specifically, I also want to share the Terraform Cloud Resume homepage challenge before we move on. And the goal of the challenge is to explain the importance of infrastructure as code and how to scale it in an organization. And the goal is to deploy infrastructure resources to the cloud of your choice. There's more about why you would want to do that. And I think that's for your own reading here. I just kind of want to show you what I've been up to. So that would be the challenge homepage for the two different links. In my case, I've already deployed my live website here, right? And it looks like this. This is the front end that we're trying to deploy with Terraform. Part of the challenge is to convert that into infrastructure as code. The first thing you would need to do is a resource group. This is the resource group that holds the front-end resources. I call it Cloud Resume Challenge. For this video, I'm actually going to randomize that, and I'll show you later. Inside the resource group, we have basically just a storage account, which is enabled as a static website. In the storage account, when you enable the feature, the static website runs because it automatically generates a storage container for you, which you'll find here on the storage browser under $web. And when you're setting up, you get to indicate the entry point for the website, which in this case would be index.html. And you also have the opportunity to add a custom error page. In this case, I just made a basic 404.html. And in order to have some style for the website, I obviously had a styles folder and some assets, and in my case, just an icon for the new tab. And finally, in order to get that last bit of the challenge, there is a little bit of JavaScript. The Cloud Resume Challenge recommends having a script update a visitor count that is stored in an Azure Cosmos DB table, which I'll terraform in another video. And I have an extra script here for just the dropdowns. The rest of the resources that we need to deploy are related to the CDN, the Content Delivery Network, which involves coming up with a CDN profile like this one. And in a CDN profile, you get to add endpoints like this one, which will map to custom domains, which is something you'll also have to add. So that's all that we're trying to convert into Terraform code today. Now that we understand what resources we're converting into infrastructure as code with Terraform, I can bring you guys over to my VS Code, where we'll actually apply the changes. And in the spirit of the Cloud Resume Challenge, I actually won't show you line by line how these are configured, but I will share the overall steps on how to get it done. Right? So we have the code here under my main.tf. I already have my terminal logged in and my variables exported. So all we have to do here is apply and auto approve. And we can talk about how we can talk about the overall steps while this is being done. So it's just going to go off and do that since I have the auto approve flag on. And that means I should bring you guys back to here. I can talk about the different prereqs in order to get the start. So let's actually just focus on prerequisites here. In order to terraform your Cloud Resume challenge, there are a few prerequisites. The first step would be to add Terraform itself. The challenge guide actually gives pretty useful links for how to set everything up. So for the prerequisites, there's install Terraform, configure access credentials on the CLI, which it actually recommends down here in step 3. If you set up your CLI, you do not need to write the credentials in the provider configuration. If you're publishing it to a GitHub repository, you have to be more careful about not hard coding your credentials right into Terraform code. It's okay if it's working in private, but since this is a project that you want to share with other people, then you'll need to come up with environment variables locally. And then when you put it up on GitHub, you'll have to set it up there as well, right? Every green piece of text here leads to something pretty good to read in order to get through the challenge. But let's bring you back to the whiteboard. The next thing you'll want to do, or the next thing I did, was create a Terraform directory where you will initialize your Terraform backend after creating a main.tf file and adding your providers. In my case, I added the Azure cloud provider, DigitalOcean as well, because I'm using them to manage my DNS records. And I added the random provider in order to add some randomization to the code I was testing, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And as I've kind of already talked about, you will either export environment variables in order to establish what subscription you're deploying code to in Azure. They also had to add a variable for the DigitalOcean API token, which is listed under here. And once you finally have all the providers and your variable set up, you can initialize your Terraform backend with a Terraform init, that's init, and that would be the prerequisites. Okay, and now that the prerequisites are done and dusted, it's time to start writing some code that will actually deploy resources onto Azure. I have under here an Azure resource section, and what you would need to look up, and I have these listed in the order that I tested them, where every time I configured a new Azure resource, I would hit Terraform plan, I review the plan to see what's going to be deployed to Azure. Then afterwards, I would hit Terraform apply and visit the portal to see if it deployed exactly what I wanted, right? So the first step, since everything in Azure is managed in a resource group, is testing whether you have a resource group deploy or not. And the Terraform equivalent is like that. I really recommend stopping at this point to try it and apply the code instead of running through all of the Azure resources here. But once you can deploy at least the most basic thing, the resource group, you can move on and try to get the rest figured out. And I did them step by step. Then the next thing I did was an Azure storage account with no extra features, like no static website, no blobs, just to see if a storage account can be deployed. You can do this iteratively. If you're doing it one resource at a time, you'll see that a new resource might be added or a new resource might be changed depending on how Terraform wants to manage those resources in order to give you what you asked for. So that brings us back to here where I said, each of these features is its own configuration. You could actually enable the static website in the same configuration block as the storage account, but I would recommend you separate that as its own resource. And what I mean by that would be something like this. So for the storage blobs, I had one for the scripts, I had one for the index.css, I had one for the assets that leads to the icons, and then one for the index.html. That way you would know where to narrow down a specific change to. If you had one block of code dedicated to one thing, it'll be a little easier to troubleshoot when something doesn't work. That's what I mean to say. And once you have the storage account and the static website configured correctly, then it's time to move on to everything related to the CDN. And in my case, I needed to add a DNS record where I added a CNAME record to create a subdomain. For the CDN, I listed it in order. First, you will come up at an Azure RM _CDN _profile, and so on in order to get the CDN deployed with a profile, an endpoint, and a custom domain associated with it in order to enable the HTTPS that the Cloud Resume Challenge is recommending you add. If you guys stop and pause here and write these down and look this up, you can open up a tab for each one of these and slowly iterate through the different resources and check Azure every time you apply new Terraform code. At some point, you'll have it all hooked up together. So one of the first obstacles I encountered was due to hard coding resource names during testing. I encountered a few errors with specifically the storage account, where I was trying to upload a blob to a specific container. And I think because I hard coded names, I would encounter a 400 level error saying I don't have access to that specific container. And I think it's because I reused some names. So I needed to add the random provider, which I mentioned to you guys earlier. I'll show you guys here now where I have that. So I added a random string to basically every cloud resource, including the DNS record, in order to get around any limits around reusing names. So I'd recommend you guys do something like that. So that was the first obstacle. Another obstacle I'm going to share is that when you're uploading blobs to the different containers in order to get the static website, all the resources it needs to run, when you do this in Terraform and you copy the sample code, you'll probably run into an issue where it's not behaving exactly the way you thought it would. I'd recommend you look at the content type that you have set for your blobs. That's probably the issue. The next point where I ran into an obstacle was with the domain name. If you're following the sample code that's given under the DigitalOcean provider for specifically DigitalOcean record, it will give you an example where it also adds the main domain name. You don't want the main domain added into your Terraform code, because that would mean destroying it when you want to clean this all up at the end. One other obstacle I want to share was the CDN endpoint example code will lead to a URI error. When you're clicking through the portal in order to deploy the CDN endpoint, for some reason it just works. But when you're converting it to Terraform code, the sample code isn't enough in order for it to work properly. What I ended up doing to solve this in the end was opening up the CDN endpoint, looking at as many settings as I could, and comparing it side by side with what I'm deploying with Terraform. And I found one field that wasn't set at all because it was considered an optional feature, but it does need to be added to your configuration in order for the CDN to work correctly. And it was under origin host headers, which when you're deploying it through the portal, it just does it correctly. Like I said, the sample code for Terraform doesn't do that. It's an optional field. And then finally, Terraform has a hard time cleaning up all the resources correctly. It specifically gets hung up on deleting a DNS record since it sees that it's still attached to an endpoint. And in order to get a complete deletion of all the resources with this project, you actually have to manually stop the endpoint and then manually delete the DNS record that you created and Terraform Destroy will figure out the rest, which is not ideal because the whole point of adding Terraform to your code is to be able to manage the whole life cycle of the things you're writing in one place, and there should be less manual inputs. Right. So let's see if VS Code is done with deploying all my resources. So if I scroll down here, you can see that apply is complete. There were 13 resources added. So if we go back to our browser, now that the Terraform apply is done, and we visit my resource groups right here, and you click refresh, you'll see that I added a resource group rg-crc-random string, which will have all the same resources that I showed you earlier that will represent the terraformed version of my front end, right? So we could visit the storage account. You'll see the same containers. In the storage browser, you'll see a $web that has index.html, custom error page, the styles, the assets, and the same scripts, right? Then there's also the CDN resources, the profile and the endpoint itself, where let's just visit it through here. Let's visit the actual endpoint with the random string attached to it. This is the endpoint configured to go visit the storage account that has a static website. Then if we visit my DigitalOcean control panel, you'll see here, we can see here that we have another CNAME record with a random string, randomstring.arvinjahil.save. We'll visit this too to see if the endpoint has a custom domain associated to it and if that is set up correctly, which in this case it is. So this is how I tested whether or not I could terraform the front end of my Cloud Resume challenge. The resources work as expected, and I'll probably destroy this off screen. Before we wrap up, I remember that I wanted to share ways to extend the project. It's not just the obstacles I encountered while terraforming the front end of my Cloud Resume challenge. If you visit the Terraform challenge page, there's already a few ideas here on what you can do in order to get extra credit. You can destroy your resources with Terraform by hitting Terraform destroy and seeing if you could spin it all up from scratch when you reapply it. You can configure a GitHub repository and hook up GitHub Actions in order to trigger your Terraform apply and all that stuff. And I think I'll do that alongside the next steps of the Cloud Resume challenge where you're adding GitHub Actions to your front end and your back end. I'm going to save that work for later. And some other ideas here is importing your existing backend infrastructure into Terraform management. You could try doing the same things with multi-cloud and so on. So now we're at the end of the video where I showed you guys how I use Terraform on my Cloud Resume challenge front end. I will be making another video for the backend resources where I'll use Terraform to deploy an Azure function, an Azure Cosmos DB resource with a table that will hold the visitor count that will be updated when someone visits your front end. And if you guys want to see that video I'd recommend you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell in order to get a heads up on when that video comes out. And I'll see you guys in the next one.